Thank you so much to our government group for your guidance and strong support of the UN Global Compact over many years. I'm Dan Thomas, Chief of Communications and Strategic Events here at the UN Global Compact, and it gives me great pleasure to introduce a man who was instrumental in setting up the initiative in the first place. Samak Moody Stewart, a leading businessman, was in the room with Georg Kell and John Ruggie when the Secretary-General Kofi Annan called for a global compact at the World Economic Forum in 1999. But before we go live to Samak at his home in Sussex, here's a short film about how it all began.
My name is Mark Moody Stewart, and I've been involved in the Global Compact since Kofi Annan issued his challenge to businesses to try and put a human face on globalization. The UN in general thought that the UN was the business of governments. It was absolutely revolutionary for the UN to reach out to business. And it was very brave of Kofi Annan.
I propose that you, the business leaders here gathered in Davos, and we, the United Nations, initiate a global compact of shared values and principles which will give a human face to the global market. I call on you, individually through your firms and collectively through your business associations, to embrace, support, and enact a set of core values in the areas of human rights, labor standards, and environmental practices.
Kofi Annan made this quite impassioned call, and part of his genius was that he didn't just challenge business, he also added in civil society and labor organizations. And that was absolutely fundamental, because if he'd just said business and left other sectors of society on the sidelines to monitor and point at business, it would not have worked, I think. An essential part was that those bits of society also said, we have to work with business to deliver it. And that was something quite revolutionary as well. It was the idea that you could build into your business this DNA of supporting the objectives of the United Nations.
When we launched this initiative, there were probably 5 companies in the world who would say in their policies and what they're doing that human rights matter for them. Gradually, a whole movement has emerged. The response was almost overwhelming. We have to find practical ways to strengthen the social and environmental pillars. And this can be done in complement to economic expansion, not in contradiction to. And that is the basic philosophy of the compact.
The development of the MDGs was, of course, linked in some ways to the progress of the Global Compact, but the MDGs were fundamentally developed by governments. And that's the huge change and an evidence of the role of business, that the Sustainable Development Goals have been developed with massive input by business all around the world. Kofi Annan made the speech in Davos, and business is now accepted by the majority of the UN as an essential partner. And equally, there's been change on the business side. Businesses have begun to realize that they cannot do it without government.
And so now we have Samak Moody Stewart on the line. Thank you for joining us, Samak.
It's a pleasure.
In that video clip, we heard the then Secretary-General Kofi Annan referencing the principles of the United Nations Global Compact, the principles that he was asking private sector leaders to sign up to, human rights, labor rights, and protecting the environment. When was the 10th principle added, and why?
Originally, when Kofi Annan made that speech, we'd seen a draft of the speech, which Georg Kell and John Ruggie had drafted, and it had a reference to corruption in it. And when I listened to the speech, the reference had been dropped. I think actually Kofi Annan was absolutely right, because as Secretary General, I think Secretaries General come under attack for going outside what member states have asked them to do. And he was able to say, well, when they said, what are you doing talking to business? He was able to say, well, I'm only asking them to follow the conventions which you sign. And at that time, there was, in fact, no UN Convention against corruption. So we had work to do to, first of all, the UN had work to do to get a convention. And then when that convention existed, we were able to put on a 10th principle, the fight against corruption. And that was quite difficult to do because one or two companies said, hey, you're moving the goalposts. And, we signed up to 9 principles and we promised to report on them, and now you're adding a 10th.
Thank you. So we've had those 10 principles since then, since 2003. They haven't changed since. Do you feel that they're still relevant today, those 10 principles?
I feel they're absolutely relevant, and they form the basis with those principles on human rights, environment, labor conditions, working conditions, and anti-corruption. You cover pretty well the whole waterfront. And what happens now is in 2015, the UN brought in the Sustainable Development Goals, 17 of them, and we always say, get the basis right. The principles are how you do it, and the Sustainable Development Goals are what we need to do. And I think that still holds. And it's important that corruption should be in there because, of course, there isn't a specific Sustainable Development Goal on corruption. There's one on rule of law and sound governance, under which corruption or anti-corruption comes. But it's very important that we get the principles embedded and reported on, and then what we're going to do building on that. If you just jump straight into the SDGs, you have people saying, look at all the great things I'm doing on goal, whichever, but actually it may be built on clay.
Right. So you were in the room that day in Davos in 1999 when Kofi Annan made the speech, proposed the UN Global Compact. You've seen us grow from very small beginnings. I think you were one of the CEOs that immediately signed up to be part of the UN Global Compact at the time. How have you seen the initiative grow over the years?
Well, one of the reasons that we saw the draft of the speech was that Georg Kell and Kofi Annan and John Ruggie wanted to make sure that somebody would sign up to it. So I think 30 or 40 companies were encouraged to be ready to say yes, with pleasure. And we've seen it grow, and I think one of the reasons that we've seen it grow, not as fast as we'd hoped, is that the Global Compact has some unique selling points. There are many splendid organizations dealing with sustainable development. There's only one which is firmly based on principles, says companies have to report on those principles, and has teeth. If you don't report on the principles, you're delisted. But in addition to that, it's from the beginning, Kofi's genius, I think, was that he called on civil society and labor unions. So built into the board, the governance structure of the Global Compact is this multi-stakeholderism. And that last point is that it's not just for big companies. Some organizations work on the top 1,000, 2,000 big companies and their supply chains and think, job done. Job's not done like that. We need every company in every country of the world. And that's where the local networks come in. So I think we've grown. It's quite tough because the conditions, it's not just sign up and forget about it or sign up and pay your fee. It's sign up and really commit to doing something and reporting publicly, which is a tough hurdle. But the growth has been enormously impressive and very encouraging in local networks all around the world.
Yeah, we have 68 local networks now. They're working with companies at the national and the local level. How do you see their contribution to this initiative?
It's absolutely fundamental, their contribution. There have been times when we had more local networks, because again, it sounds easy. Let's have a local network. But actually, we need conditions and discipline. And that's something I think we now have. So a clear relationship between the center and the networks. The dream, for me, the dream of the local networks is that in each and every country, you've grown a multi-stakeholder organization which can help encourage governments. It's a coalition which can, with trust, because it's not just one sector, with trust, encourage governments to really move forward fast on the Sustainable Development Goals, but also on the basic principles, so encouraging them while where they are not doing a good job, speaking out from a position of coalition and strength. That's a dream. We will get there. And in some places and some countries, I think we're making good progress.
This summit will address three global crises: the global health crisis brought on by this COVID-19 pandemic, the climate crisis, an ongoing crisis that we must get right, and an inequality crisis. How do you feel what is the role of the private sector in addressing these global challenges, would you say?
I think that clearly we have a role in all of them. It's very much focused at the moment on COVID. But if you look at inequality, we in businesses have a real job to do. And to look at the differentials, it's very easy for CEOs to say, yeah, we worry about differentials. But leaders of companies have to look at the distribution of remuneration within their own organization. What's the range? And the range has grown and widened enormously over the past 20 years or so. Prior to that, it was relatively static. And that's fundamentally a problem. And it's difficult to put the genie back in the bottle. And it cannot be addressed simply by philanthropy. We need to look at valuing the contribution. And out of COVID, of course, have come a realization that we as a society have not valued the contribution of many essential people, health workers, frontline workers, but not just them, train drivers, people in society. Now, we in business understand that within our own business, but we don't always get it right. In fact, unfortunately, as I say, the top has moved away from the middle and bottom. But
Samak,
we have to demonstrate that.
You've seen the UN Global Compact grow from infancy through early years, the awkward teenage years. We're now 20 years old. What are your hopes for the future?
My hopes rest on the local networks. If we could in each and every country have a really good functioning local network, an alliance of civil society, labor organizations, business-led, but an alliance which could help steer society and guide governments and encourage governments to do the right things. I think an organization like that would be much more trusted than just business or any of the components on their own. That's my dream.
Thank you very much, Samak, Moody, Stewart. Thank you for joining us for the UN Global Compact 20th Anniversary Leaders Summit.
Thank you, and congratulations on those fantastic academies you've been running.